We've made our way from the town of Yorktown across the York River, and now we're at a place called Gloucester Point. And we're in Tyndall's Park here at Gloucester Point, and today we're going to explore these grounds and learn a little bit about this British outpost that was built here, a vital British outpost. And we're also going to see some Civil War era fortifications from 1862. So let's see what we can find here. So we're in Tyndall's Point Park here at Gloucester Point, and right away you can see the remnants of some earthworks there. And I just wanted to give you a little layout of the land here. It looks like this map is going to be a little better. So here, this is Yorktown, and directly across from Yorktown is called Gloucester Point. Now when Cornwallis would fortify Yorktown, he would also fortify Gloucester Point to protect his rear. And this position was vital because securing Gloucester Point gave Cornwallis a means of egress if he needed it, and it gave him the ability to have some sort of supply line. Remember, the French blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, and at that time rivers were vital highways. So in theory, Cornwallis would settle here and he would be resupplied and refit from the sea. So Gloucester Point was really the only means of egress that Cornwallis had. Now this position allowed the British to forage beyond the lines for supplies, not only for themselves but for their horses as well. And if this position was compromised, Cornwallis would be in pretty big trouble. Here's another example of what we were just talking about. Here's your French fleet blockading the Chesapeake, and I'm intrigued by this earthenwork fortification over here, so let's go and see what we can learn over here. So here's one of the outer parapets here. Now, it's important to note that most of the earthworks we're seeing today are from the American Civil War, not the American Revolution. This position would play a vital role again in 1862 during the Peninsula Campaign. The Confederates would build a star fort right before us here, and this is one of the walls from that star fort. So something to keep in mind is a lot of these earthworks that we're seeing aren't from the American Revolution, but they are from the American Civil War. And as you can see, it wraps all the way around here, all the way to that other side. Now the York River is probably, I would say 200 yards in this direction. And you gotta remember this position here, a lot of these trees, obviously the house and this highway here wouldn't have been here. So this would have been quite the position. So when the Confederates would build this star fort, earthen fortification, it would have been 7.5 feet high, and the walls would have been at least 20 feet thick. And 12 guns would have been here defending this location. Now you gotta think, when a cannonball or a artillery shell from that time strikes this earthen fortification, the damage is gonna be minimal. And even if there is damage, it's gonna be easily repaired. Something I thought was pretty interesting was this picture here. Now obviously this is an illustration, but this shows the Union occupying Yorktown here, and they have an observation balloon up. And way over here, this is Gloucester Point and the Confederate fortifications here. So this kind of giving you what this area would have looked like at that time. All right, so this is pretty cool. This is the breech of a Parrott rifle. And you can tell it was a Parrott rifle because of this reinforced iron ring here. Now this artillery piece would have been from the American Civil War. And I was reading on one of these signs, they're not quite sure why it exploded, but either way, here it is on display. And man, this thing is absolutely massive. You can kind of see my hand here, and it's just massive. You can just imagine what the entire gun would have looked like. Gosh. So we obviously see some of these Civil War era fortifications, but what would this area look like under Tarleton's command? Well, here's his basic defensive line. Looks like you have a few readouts there, and obviously our reference where we are. And across the river, you get a little sliver of Yorktown there. So here, they were truly isolated, but they were protecting Cornwallis's rear position. So if you're wondering, how come the British didn't attempt to escape via Gloucester Point? Well, they actually did. And this reads, on the night of October 16th, 1781, after almost 3 weeks of an American-French siege, the British defenses at Yorktown were crumbling. In a last-ditch effort to save his army, General Cornwallis decided on a desperate plan. He would have most of his army row across the river and escape northward through the 2,900 American and French soldiers besieging Gloucester Point. After midnight, the British started ferrying troops in 16 boats across the York River, using the cover of darkness. They rowed the first 1,000 soldiers safely over to Gloucester Point. Then a sudden storm with high winds and violent squalls scattered the boats. Cornwallis called off his risky escape, and the next morning, on October 17th, his men rowed back in full view of Washington's forces. Now, with the hope of escape gone, Cornwallis would request a ceasefire to discuss surrender terms. And this quote here by Banastre Tarleton, thus expired the last hope of the British Army. So like we discussed a little earlier, this area being secured by Tarleton and the British kind of gave the British a little safety valve. Now, British forces here were able to scavenge and forage and bring back some supplies for the men and horses. Well, that would change, and we're going to see the site where Tarleton would fight his last fight. So we're a couple hundred yards outside of the fortifications that would have been at Gloucester Point. And we're here on this field, and it doesn't look like much today, but this is where the largest cavalry engagement of the American Revolution took place. So we're here just off the highway here at Gloucester Point, and this field before us, this is a spot where the largest cavalry engagement of the American Revolution took place. And that engagement would be called the Battle of the Hook. Now, this took place on October 3rd, 1781. So outside the fortifications here on Gloucester Point, the British forces were able to forage for supplies, not only for themselves, but for their horses. Well, the American and French knew that, so they moved in forces, a contingent of French cavalry, French Marines, and select American militia. And on October 3rd, 1781, the largest cavalry action of the American War of Independence, you have Lauzon's Legion and Lieutenant Colonel John Mercer's Select Battalion of Militia defeated Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton's British Legion and detachment of Royal Welsh Fusiliers. As many as 1,300 troops would take place in this engagement, half of them mounted, and the American and French victory here ended those foraging operations for the British forces, which in turn helped speed up the process of Cornwallis' surrender. Now, this French and American victory here also helped encircle Cornwallis completely. He could have used Gloucester Point as a means of egress and retreat, but since now the American and French forces were here and the British were confined to their fortifications, he was truly trapped. And they have a historic marker here. At this point, known formally as the Hook, on October 3rd, 1781, a fierce engagement took place between the British forces under the command of Tarleton and the Continentals under the command of Lauzon. This was the last engagement of the opposing forces before the surrender of General Cornwallis at Yorktown on October 19th, 1781. And that took place on this field right here. Wow. So I thought this was pretty interesting. It may be a little hard to read with the glare here, but it reads, near this place on October 19th, 1781, a surrender occurred 1 hour after the surrender at Yorktown. The British troops under Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton surrendered to the French Brigadier General M. de Chaussee, commander of the French and American forces, thus ending British rule in America. So an hour after Cornwallis would surrender across the river, the forces here at Gloucester Point would surrender. So that was Gloucester Point. It's a spot on the Yorktown battlefield that doesn't really get a whole lot of attention. And as we saw, once Tarleton was defeated and he had to pull back to these fortifications, it really did help encircle the British completely and put the pressure on Cornwallis. It was pretty cool not only seeing some of the fortifications from the American Revolution, but learning a little bit about the Confederate position here almost 100 years later. So hope you learned a thing or two, because as always I did, and we'll catch you on the next one.